Morning, Meetali.
Morning, Dhaval.
Good to be in office this early to record.
I'm loving being in office today. Back from the jungles and into a very unusual setup. So very excited.
Awesome. Let's kickstart this conversation by talking a little bit about your journey. So, how's your journey been so far as a professional and as an individual in this whole product management space?
I think it's been very fascinating. I started way back 2005, where I was just out of an engineering college, joined a startup, which is back then I didn't know this word, but we were literally bootstrapped, and we were building products that automated procurement services. So 2 months, 3 months into the job, I was asked to go accompany another product manager for requirement gathering, which was quite surprising because I was there to code. And that's, I think, what began my journey into product management. I was doing everything that a product manager did without the title. The only difference between then and now is I came back and wrote the code myself to what I had to deliver. But those years is what established that I loved being in front of customers. I loved solving problems, and I realized that me personally resonated very well with solving business problems. And I think I was more effective at that rather than writing codes. So from there, I then took off. I finished my master's, and then once again joined the workforce back, but this time more around, driving pre-sales. So we were part of these, we were part of these large deal team, and we used to work and stitch together customer solutions. So once again, we were there sitting in front of customers, trying to understand what their problems are, what do they want to do, and then stitch together a very good compact services piece.
Yeah, and while you talk about it, I just wanted to interject here. When you spoke about an interesting thing about you starting off as a programmer, right? How important sometimes it is to really know the stuff so well to be able to evolve into larger roles around it, right? Because if you've coded and you've written code yourself, you really have a very strong appreciation for people who code, and you value the function a lot more, which kind of in some sense I would say makes you more grounded as well as more mature in leading higher order functions in that same domain, right?
So I think it's a very strong advantage that you get as a program manager if you have started your journey as an engineer.
Yeah.
The engineering know-how kind of gives you a very broad as well as a narrow view into things. So you are able to transition faster from the big picture view, which you need to take when you are with the customers. Yeah. And when you then need to deliver it and plan for it, you are able to accommodate the nuances of
Absolutely.
it. I feel a good bunch of product managers whom I know have actually transitioned from that journey.
Yeah.
And it is, I'm not saying it's mandatory, but it's an added advantage. It kind of really, it makes the transition and the toggle very seamless.
Absolutely.
So when you're talking to customers, you've been there, you've done that, and you can easily move. Like I always say, we operate in 3 planes. One's the impact plane.
Yes.
What impact are you going to create? How are you going to execute? And how are you going to finally operate? You can toggle between these 3 layers very, very easily.
Effectively, right. And it also allows you to empathize with people who are building the product as well, right?
Absolutely.
Because that somehow brings it all together in a much more stronger, mature fashion, right?
And it's a very creative, while coding appears to be a very structured way, there is a lot of creativity into it.
Absolutely.
How do you write things in a more optimized way, and you're dealing with a whole bunch of variables. I think it's more left brain than the right brain. Product managers are essentially right brain. So that's when I think those two, when they come together, I always used to wonder whether product management is an art or is it science. And over the years, I think it has evolved.
That's a beautiful point, and I can totally relate to it because I started my journey as a software engineer as well, right? And I loved coding. I still love coding. Obviously, I don't code anymore, but this whole aspect of left brain, right brain coming into play as a product manager, but also as a programmer, and then putting all of that into perspective, right? Someone very beautifully said there's this beautiful line which says, "Code is poetry."
Code is poetry, yes.
Right, and it's such a profound statement because you can never overstate the importance of beautifully written code, right? Yeah. And when you love coding, you can cascade that sentiment into everything else that you do at the highest order, right up to being a CTO or even a CEO. all the way from starting off as a software engineer, because that core sentiment of really enjoying coding or enjoying building products and therefore enjoying solving problems as an extension of that really it comes together very well, right? So that's interesting. And while we talk about this, right, as a product manager, how do you think your role has evolved over the years, right? Because and like you rightly pointed out earlier on, that apparently when you started off, you're probably doing the job of a product manager, but that title probably didn't exist then, right? I think that's, the whole label of product management has suddenly started becoming more and more relevant maybe over the last 10 years or so, as opposed to, how things used to be before. Maybe you could be called a project manager, or you could be called a program manager or something like that. But this whole thing about product management as a domain and product management as a skill set and as a function has evolved in the coming years, right? So how do you see your role? How do you think your role has changed from what you used to be over where you are right now?
So I think there has been a lot of change in the way I see the evolution has taken place. Maybe it was my career trajectory, or it is the way the industry evolved. I would want to believe it's a mix of two, because back then 2005 SaaS was unheard of. The word startups were unheard of. All I knew is I was working in a small company. Yeah. All right. So I think we've evolved a lot, and there is a lot of awareness on the need to have somebody as a product owner, yeah, versus having somebody as a product or a project manager.
Correct.
Okay. So maybe when I started, the role didn't exist. So they said, okay, it could be business analyst, it could be a project manager, it can be a mix of the two. Back then, I was not really concerned about the title. Yeah. Back then, I found myself doing something very exciting. We were working with a customer to solve his problem, building a product, right, that we wanted to scale and take to other customers. Right. So it was very exciting, and we did everything right, from understanding what is the value we are going to bring, what the product is going to do, what problems it's going to solve, and then come back and figure out how do we deliver it. So I realized there are two aspects to my role. One is, and that still stays, okay, even back then or even today. One is how do you create the product, and one is how do you enable the team to deliver that product. And this is where I think, once again going back, the left brain, right brain. Yeah. How do you, one is all structured, logic, right, you're out there doing things in a proper structured way. And then is the place where you have to work with people, remove challenges, remove obstacles, figure out where you're going to fail. Are you going to fail? Are you following the happy path? What is it that's going to take to deliver the vision that we had when we do? Yeah. So to me, it is more of a craft, yeah, that you, absolutely, as you do more and more projects, as you deliver more and more products, you kind of evolve in the way you handle it along the way.
Absolutely.
And that's for me been the biggest change. And also what helped is the way the industry is also moved. Right. And so the role of the product manager has now come into a good spotlight.
Absolutely. And also here, how do you, so since you mentioned two very interesting points, one is, again, we can't again iterate enough on this whole left brain, right brain thing. So I'll come back to that again in terms of how it's essential for problem solving in these times, right? Because technology largely is parity. I mean, we are living in the most amazing times where technology is so democratic that almost everyone has access to it. The real skill is in problem solving. The real skill is in articulating the problem in the right way. The real skill is in identifying the right problems to solve, and the real skill is in solving the problems in the best way possible. So I'll come back to that again, but just one quick point that I want to pick up from what you just said is, when you transition into, more people oriented, more process oriented, and more structure oriented kind of a role, how difficult it is to negate the urge to jump in and fix the problem yourself, right? Because you're a coder. When you see something is not right, there's always this tendency to, just dive in and just fix it yourself rather than following a process or allowing people to take care of it, right? That, I think, sometimes also becomes a challenge for practitioners, because you always feel that, you can go out there and fix it. But how do you take a step back and allow the system or people to take care of it rather than you having to do it yourself?
So when I'm in that situation, I ask myself, am I wanting to be a good program manager, or I'm wanting to be a good employer? Okay. If a situation demands that, no, we need someone to step in and fix something,
Yeah.
I'll do it at that time.
Yeah.
It will not make me a great program manager.
Of course.
Okay, but maybe the organization needs it at that time, or the team needs it at that time. So it's a situation call. It takes some effort to hold back,
Right.
because you would want to just quickly roll your
Yeah.
sleeves, and you know you can do it.
Yeah.
But you're essentially doing somebody else's job,
Right.
maybe hampering the growth path.
Yes.
So it's a situational call.
Yeah.
To me, it's very important to know what's happening at that point.
Correct.
If it's just to be a good employee, yeah, let's do it. The team needs it, the organization needs it,
Yeah.
and you're out there.
Yeah.
But if not,
Yeah.
I think you as a program manager need to hold back
Right.
and let the people do what they have to do. So I have this I read this very interesting analogy about program managers being the coach for the team,
Right.
but the captain is someone else.
Yeah.
So when the captain steps into the field and each of them need to do their work, he needs to step back and let what he set the team up to do to execute it.
Absolutely.
So I think that works for me.
Yeah, and I think that nicely segues into this other area that we can talk about, which is how have you seen your individual journey and skill sets and mindset evolve across the different kinds of organizations that you work for, right? Starting right from startups to pretty large organizations, and then, you know, moving into LogiNext and all of that. Because I think somewhere the maturity of product management really has a lot to do with the stage of the organization's growth curve, right? Someone who is like T plus 3 months into the game versus someone who's like T plus 10 years into the game versus someone who's like 1,000 people organization versus someone who's like a 50 people organization versus someone who's a startup versus someone who's a product company versus someone which is a services company trying to build products, right? So all of these and many other such combinations. So all of these scenarios kind of call for different level of maturity in product management. And I think you've been lucky enough to have straddled a few of these scenarios yourself. So how do you see that whole maturity of product management coming into play depending on the kind of organization context that you're working in?
So if I go back and I reflect, so I've been in organizations where we are setting up, there's just no process, we are evolving the process as we build. And then into larger organizations where we have set processes, where we need to align to the process and then accomplish what we have to do. Within that large organization, I think I did 2-3 projects where each had their own flavor. Okay, so there was some where we were like a small company in a large organization, so we get a lot of flexibility to do things around, to set up the process, to define what we want to do. Then there are times when we are handed over a backlog.
Yeah.
Saying,
inherit the
yes,
backlog.
like this was the vision, this is what you want to accomplish, here's the backlog,
Yeah.
boom, now go deliver.
Right.
Okay, build the team and
Right.
deliver the practice. Okay, and then into a place like LogiNext where we are high growth, where we're looking to scale, where we have good people who want to really deliver.
Yeah.
So I think across them, the way I split the activities is depending on where the team is, which level are you operating in. So I always break it down into the pyramid, like the strategic layer, the tactical layer, where you're more focused on the execution. Strategic layer is your product strategy. What is your roadmap going to be? What are you going to deliver? And then at the operational level, where you have your backlog, now go run with it and make sure your team executes to the T. So to me, irrespective of first whether the organization size or what is the construct, you first need to figure out where is that team right now.
Yeah.
Okay, in the place where we were, where going back to my example, where we didn't have anything, we spent a lot of time on the product strategy,
Okay.
talking to 2-3 customers who wanted that feature,
Yeah.
and then build the product from there. So the amount of time we spent on the vision, on the strategy layer was so much higher at that point,
Right.
as compared to when I was with large scale organizations where we spend a lot of time at the execution layer, where we would have a lot of strategic framework defined for us, and then we need to build how you want to execute it.
Correct.
As compared to when there were times that I was handed over a product backlog saying, here, please go run with this. Okay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then you operate intensively at the operational layer. However, at any point in time, you need to toggle between the three layers.
Absolutely.
You would have a comfort in a certain layer, but you will go up and down through each of these layers to make sure that your project or your product is heading in the direction where you intend it to. So, irrespective of the size of the organization, I think my recommendation, what worked for me as a product manager, is look at which stage of the product life cycle you are in,
Absolutely.
and that's your way forward.
Yeah, and correct. And I think the maturity of a product manager also evolves in a good way when you start becoming better or more adept at straddling across those three layers that you spoke about, right? When you need to be strategic, when you need to be a taskmaster, when you need to be more focused on delivering something on a certain timeline, etc. I think the ability to straddle across these things would really matter a lot, in fact, and that will be like one of the key aspects of a good strong product manager, right? So I think that's a good interesting takeaway from it. Also, just kind of extending this a little bit more into this whole process orientation and documentation and all of that comes along with product management, right? I think sometimes, again, in relatively smaller organizations, or when you're in that build mode, right? Like very few people in the organization, you've just started up, the energy is really high, everyone's pumped up with the vision of the organization, they want to build something really amazing. You probably may not even have an organization structure, so to speak, but you're a bunch of people motivated to ship like a really solid MVP or a really solid product out there, right? At that point, your focus is just to build a great product. You're not too worried about the process, you're not too worried about documentation, etc. But as you grow, those things become even more important. And I think as you grow, product management becomes more and more and more important to your growth trajectory. And while there is this, this constant pressure from business where you need to ship the product quickly, you need to ship a particular feature quickly, and you need to ensure that you are constantly being relevant to your customers' requirements. So sometimes there's this need or urge to just circumvent the whole documentation process, or not worry about the process so much as worrying about the feature or the product enhancement that needs to go live, right? How do you handle these kind of challenges, or how do you assert or sort of ensure compliance and drive that emotional aspect of ensuring that no matter what it is, you got to follow the process? Because sometimes these shortcuts that people take and end up creating a lot of technical debt, as they call it, over a period of time, which eventually becomes much more difficult to handle rather than handling it right at the point of origin, right? So how do you drive that clarity in teams and people that you work with, sometimes even against the expectations of business and the project expectations, etc.? How do you drive that clarity of ensuring that you follow the structure, you follow the process, you follow the documentation, because that's the right way of going about it? How do you drive that?
So, I think I evolved with time. Like I said, early days I used to really hate the process.
Yeah.
I was more around that, let's get it to the customer really fast. And then I realized that one of the key things that as product managers you need to manage is communication. You need to have one thing said which has a singular interpretation. Sometimes lack of process, lack of correct documentation leads to multiple interpretations, and that's a perfect recipe for disaster.
Absolutely.
All right. So how do you hold fort on having a very singular, single interpretable communication?
Yeah.
And that happens when you have certain level of documents, which not just help the team who is working on the project right now, but once you move on and there is some other team who comes, maybe to support,
Yeah.
or maybe to enhance whatever role and capacity, they have some historic record of what we thought, why we thought a certain way, and why we did that.
Right.
I think a lot of problem eventually I faced in my career was when the hand-me-downs happened,
Yeah.
and I am trying to solve a problem, and the puzzle, the key missing piece in the puzzle is, why did we do this?
Yeah.
What were we thinking?
Absolutely.
And there is no proof of it.
Proper explanation.
So with that in mind, yes, I do feel that you do require certain structure, a set of processes,
Yeah.
clean documentation and communication that lets you know what the team thought at certain point in time.
Yeah.
At the same time, I've also been in teams where we have over-engineered the process.
Yeah.
Okay, where the optics of the project play a very important role. The project managers, the kind of status reports that they have to release.
Yeah.
Glamorous.
Yeah.
Our expense reports, ultra glamorous. What happened in that is they spend a lot of time on low impact tasks.
Right.
Okay, I would want my team, my team of project managers. So when I had a pool of project managers who were working on independent projects, I literally had to park away one person to just fulfill all the process requirements that was set up, so that we had a compliance against the project. And I realized that most of the time these guys are working too hard on low impact tasks. And I didn't really like that. So that was the other extreme of the world, where we over engineered the process, over documented it. Somewhere I think the trick lies in how do you strike the right balance. Now we're talking about even eras where we are saying no more PRD documentation. Use Jira, and you create stories, and so we are going into that other extreme, which sometimes scares me, but at the same time excites me, saying, hey, I'm going back to that time when we move fast, we move really quick. So it's that fine balance that you strike.
Yeah.
And it's not good to be at either extreme.
I think, that's again a pretty amazing point, because it's about balance, right? And the processes exist for a certain reason, and the processes exist for the betterment of not just the product, but also all the stakeholders involved in it, right? So if you're able to build a process, and now you have enough tools and technologies to help you build processes and execute processes, right? You spoke about Jira, and there are lots and lots of open source platforms that people can get onto and do a much more powerful, efficient job of getting best of both the worlds. The agility and the faster turnaround times of the non-process world, whereas the structuredness of the whole approach, the predictability of timelines, and also the knowledge, conservation of the whole process-driven approach. So I think if you can get a good balance between these two, you are probably in a better spot, rather than gyrating onto any of, or deviating into any of these other extremes that are involved in this. So that's interesting. Also, this whole part of ensuring that something gets delivered with the highest possible quality, right? This whole focus on quality control, this whole focus on shipping the highest possible quality versus shipping fast, right? Again, that's another, kind of a dichotomy that product managers are faced with, right? Sometimes you do a good job of comprehensively detailing out a certain feature or a certain aspect of the product, versus rushing into just shipping it. So how important is quality control, and how do you strike the right balance between not over engineering a solution while still doing a good job on turning it around faster?
So if I just go back to what worked for me, I think one of the toughest tasks we do is ruthlessly prioritize. Okay, why and how does that play when we say quality and timely deliverables? So there are two ways I look at prioritization. One is which project to do, which project to drop. Because your constraints are always the same, Dhaval. You can be in a startup, you can be in a large organization. Your constraints around people, around time, around budgets, they are the common denominators you deal with. So when you look at those constraints, first is which project are you going to say yes to, are you going to say no to? You wear the big hat, okay, where you're looking at the ROI, the impact, the importance of the customer commitments, the timelines that we have given the customer, and then play your constraints against them. That's the first filter. If you've got that right, then your next challenge is, if the project is there, how do I prioritize to get this rolled out within a reasonable time and with the reasonable quality? Operating word is reasonable. I think one of the traps that I fell into is targeting the 100% mark. Okay, 100% bug free, 100% quality, within the timelines or ahead of time. And what that eventually leads to is a burnout of not just the team, but also very unrealistic expectations sometimes. The ideal world is, yes, you want to do 100%, but I think the 80-20 rule works brilliantly well. Sometimes when it comes to timeline, you really need to prioritize what is it that the customer needs.
Yeah.
Sometimes they use 20% of the features, take care of 80%.
Absolutely.
Release that first bug free.
Yeah.
For example,
Correct.
you've got the customer that initial happiness that
Correct.
goes. Then work on the remaining and then start closing, working towards it.
Absolutely.
There are no compromises ever on quality or on time.
Right.
But if you are a ruthless prioritizer,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a word,
Yeah.
but if you're able to ruthlessly prioritize,
Yeah.
you've done this two elements right. Because when you're doing that, you're taking into account your constraints.
Yeah.
You would want a certain quality of developers.
Yeah.
Maybe they're there, maybe they aren't there. You would want certain timelines,
Yeah.
certainly never there. I don't think I've ever been in a project where I said, oh, this is comfortable.
Absolutely.
All right. And then you also have the rules of budgets to play with, you know. So with that operating constraints,
Right.
I think if you're a good prioritizer, you'll get these two elements correct.
Absolutely. And another interesting point you made there is around how certain challenges are universal, irrespective of the size of the organization or the journey of the organization, etc. Like time is always a constraint, right? No matter how much time you have, you're always going to have less. Also, the kind of mindsets you need, right? Where certain, again, the whole classic Pareto's principle that you spoke about, the 80-20 rule, right? Certain problems are tougher problems and they might deliver less relative impact, whereas certain problems are easy problems, but once you solve them, they'll create much larger impact. So how do you, again, tying back to prioritization, so how do you prioritize ruthlessly, in your words, is really going to make a big difference in terms of how you deal with these opposing constraints of time and quality, right? Because you could endlessly build a feature and make it super perfect and take 100 years to build it, versus ship it out in 3 months and you are at 90% quality and you have an approach that handles the 10% deficit in a structured manner, so that you eventually get to a absolutely 1000% quality and in the stipulated time. And that's where I think the role of the product manager becomes so much more important, right? In terms of
what's changed, coming back to what
yes, because ensuring that you have 100% quality and you're delivering it in 100% time, and how do you balance that equation is where the effectiveness and the efficiency of the product manager comes into play. And also that extends into this whole point, again coming back to problem solving mindset, right? Not just as a product manager but also as a team. You need to inculcate that whole left brain, right brain thinking approach, because every time you're going to be faced with challenges which are not going to be solvable optimally by just applying analytical approaches. So you're going to have to get creative, you're going to have to start thinking out of the box, while you're also going to have to do a good job on rationalizing that creativity. You just can't have a very well articulated creative solution which just cannot be executed, right? Because you need to tie it back to possibility of executing it and the whole rationality part of it and the whole analytical part of it and all of that. So how do you first of all yourself how do you yourself become great and better at using both the left brain and right brain and using that optimal problem solving mindset when you're faced with any problem, and how do you transmit that mindset to other people and kind of make it a part of the system or the process that you're operating, so that everyone that's working with you is always able to see a problem from both these lenses, the creative lens and the analytical lens? Because I guess the sweet spot is really at the overlap of these two. You need to have that creative approach coupled with that analytical mindset to get more effective at solving problems, right?
I think I do three things, and I'll pull a few examples of how it worked. First is, I think as a product manager, your big job is decision making.
Yeah.
You are through the entire life cycle, or even through a single day, you will be held in moments where you have to take decisions, and it could be big, small decisions. It can be, what should the naming structure of the API parafield be?
Yeah.
All right, you need to decide that.
Yeah.
It could be something as critical as what should the date stamp be. Okay, and it's a very small decision, but there is a real crouching tiger hiding behind that question.
Yeah.
So the point is, when you're problem solving, you break it down to decisions that you need to take.
Yeah.
And for me, a very simple thing works. When I have to take a decision, especially on the product side, I stop and analyze what's the impact of this decision. If it's a high impact one where I have a crouching tiger who will probably pop out, then I take time to spend and gather information to be able to arrive at the good decision. If it's a low impact, I'm not spending so much time on the information gathering, just what is required so I can move on. So that decision making becomes a little sometimes creative, sometimes very factual, where you lean on what data points you have to be able to arrive at that. That's number one. Number two, and I think this is, if I go retrospect, this is a cause where most projects run into problems, assumptions. Okay, I think it's the mother of all mistakes that can happen. How are you drawing your assumptions? Are everybody on the same plane? What are the assumptions taken? I think that assumptions is such a underrated parameter, but it can really completely throw things off. You and I right now could be operating at different planes because our assumptions are completely wrong. So that's the other one I think I work on. And so assumptions, yes. So typically what I do is, that's where I think going back, communication gets very, very critical. How do you make sure everybody is communicating the right messages all across? So these are, I think, couple of things that work for me when we are when we're driving this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that is again a very interesting point. This whole thing about one faulty assumption can give you a completely different perception of anything that you're dealing with, right? And it's very important for the team to have the right assumptions, which is critical for this whole problem solving part of it.
Everyone's sitting tight on the assumptions. They assume the other person's thinking
the same, right? And how do you bring that objectivity or bring them all on the same plane as far as their assumptions are concerned is also a part of your role as a product manager, and ensuring that all stakeholders are on the same page so that you're able to drive that clarity and therefore drive the outcome you want to drive with the decisions that you take. And again, tying back to the whole prioritization thing, right? The decisions are all around setting the right priorities and then committing to solving them.
And you're working on the same set of assumptions when you're taking those decisions and the priorities. So they all interlink with one another. And I think the way it calls a craft, why I call it a craft is, some do it so seamlessly better. For some, there are very obvious misses that happen. And sometimes when you're leading a bunch of product managers, these are blind spots that you keep an eye on. That you don't know when they erupt and the way they manifest, at which point. So that's the reason why sometimes 2 days before the release, we'll be looking at, oh, we're missing the date.
I agree.
You know, so their manifestations are very dangerous, and the timing of the manifestation is,
will follow the Murphy's law basically, right? What has to go wrong will go wrong. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, you've got to befriend Murphy if you have to be a great product manager. But that's actually an interesting thing, right? Because when you say that, if I can build a team that resonates with my clarity, which I can, count on in terms of the right problem solving mindset that they'll bring into the mix when I need them to. And also ensuring that you're striking a good balance between what's required and how do you get to delivering what's required. Because sometimes there could be, like you said, faulty assumptions don't just exist in delivering the product, but also sometimes in terms of articulating the requirements itself, right? Like sometimes, the business may come to you with a certain set of requirements and they may be making all the wrong assumptions about the requirements they're coming to you about, right? So somewhere, I think that whole mindset has to trigger in right from the point, you have the brief or the input to the point that you have to deliver the output, right? So sometimes if somebody comes to you and says, hey, you know what, you got to build these 5 things, questioning the assumptions behind those 5 requirements, thinking it through, getting more deeper into understanding what problems you're attempting to solve, and getting the business users also to arrive at the same level of clarity of making the right assumptions around those requirements is another area that I would assume this skill and this mindset extends to, right?
This is one thing I always tell my team, user first. Talk to your users. What is it that, if we are able to get the user experience right, get what the user is going through in his or her own words, and then you'll be able to define that. What is your user story? To me, sometimes when I'm talking to product managers and if I want to get a sense of what they're doing, within the first few minutes of the conversation, if they're not able to bring out a user story on what their product or their service does, I kind of know that they're in a fuzzy place. Because if your user story has got fuzzy, you have somewhere along the way lost what you're trying to accomplish.
Yes.
So what is the user story? What is it that we are trying to fix?
Yeah.
If you get that right, everything else just falls through correctly.
Right. True.
Your assumptions are correct, your prioritizations are right, your decisions are aligned to what the user is saying. But in that, I think, you kind of don't, sometimes we assume that, okay, one customer's problem is every customer's problem.
Yeah.
Again, assumption. And
Yeah.
so we that's the reason why I ask those difficult questions.
Yeah.
At the onset, the more uncomfortable the questions we throw, either when we are working,
clarity you will
yes,
arrive at.
absolutely. Talk to your users as much as possible. Be in front of the customer. Get to know what they really are doing. Also, it helps in another thing that the three places I feel where user stories work. One is when you're trying to get your product strategy, your feature strategy. What is it that we want to do? How we want to deliver it.
Right.
When we are talking about the features also, one of the pitfalls that we as product managers have is we talk about features which took the biggest effort to create or develop.
Yeah.
But maybe that isn't the case for the user.
Yeah.
Because when I was talking to one of our customers a few weeks ago, he is using some of our very high-tech features, but he was absolutely thrilled and excited about a basic feature that probably took us few weeks, was on bulk scans and bulk keypods and saying you have no idea what a boom in terms of compliance and a blessing in terms of compliance it is. And I was a little stunned at that point. Then I realized that if this is what the customer wants, this should be my assumption. Or this is what I need to prioritize, and then helps in your decision.
And working really hard to build that user story that is consistent, and everyone believes in it and everyone understands it really clearly and it's very well articulated, makes the rest of the journey a lot more easier.
Absolutely. And you pointed out a very nice word where you said, how do you build that high performing team? I think as a product manager, you're very responsible for making sure that you build that team and you push the team to think big. One of the ways I think always works is if you are able to articulate a good user problem statement to the team who's going to deliver it.
Right.
They may or may not have airtime with the customers, but if you're able to paint that picture well, that what is it that we want to accomplish, why so far we haven't or anybody else has done it, and here is once you do it, this is what it's going to create. I think these three aspects, it pushes the team to accomplish.
Right, and I think I would just push that even a little further and say that, not just you articulating the whole requirement of the functionality in the right way to the team, but also allowing that collaborative approach where they participate in that articulation. Absolutely. Because that's when you actually get to be sure that they are actually seeing it in the right way. They are actually making the right assumptions. They are actually thinking it through. They are building the right story. Correct. Because the more effort you spend in getting the story right, the less effort you're going to spend in executing that story. Because once they co-articulated the story, it becomes their story. Yes. And your role, I think, if I can extrapolate that, is really to help people own these stories. Because once they own the story, they know exactly what to do.
And Dhaval, then you should see the potential you push the team to.
Yeah, and they would surprise you and they would surprise themselves with that clarity in terms of the way they can execute it, right?
It just goes so much beyond, like I have to build an API versus, this API is going to help automate the complete process for the client. There is a complete
user first
approach changes. So I think that's it's such a beaten topic, but it is so vital that if you don't have that layer in, you'll see a lot of, you'll operate at a much lower potential than what your team and you can operate.
And you may probably be working harder with lesser throughput and lesser impact and lesser value creation versus getting the story right and focusing the right time in the initial part of the story building to then ensure that, with a lot of smart work, you can achieve a much bigger impact, right? And like you just said, maybe a small feature for a certain client can be of humongous value, which probably took you a few weeks to build versus some other feature which probably took you 10x the effort, which probably might not create as much value as you expected to create. Because this also, ties back into sometimes all of us getting a little overwhelmed with certain scenarios, certain features, or certain expectations from a certain client, right? And then you just, it just hijacks your mindset where you commit to a solution which was an over-engineered solution to a problem that really didn't exist in some sense. Because, you know, sometimes the client's articulation of the problem or business's articulation of the problem is more an articulation of the symptom of the problem than the problem itself. So I think that's tying back into the earlier point where if you have a certain set of requirements, you got to kind of, you know, help the business teams and the client as well in many occasions to think through it, to really get to the most refined fundamental version of the problem. Because if they are not able to articulate the problem in its most basic form, they probably themselves do not really know what the real problem is, right? And spending more time in getting to the real problem is very, very important, because once you know what the real problem is, then you know, then everything else flows from it, right? Prioritization, decision making, what effort is it going to take to solve it, etc. But that area is one area that I feel most people sometimes, you know, end up discounting, where you're quickly wanting to jump at the solution rather than spending more time with the client or with your own team or with the business teams on defining the problem well, on really getting to the root of it and really arriving at the simplest and the finest version of the problem, which you can then take up as an input to sort of work towards. Because that process might help you get rid of a lot of fluff and get rid of a lot of faulty assumptions that, you know, different stakeholders might be making knowingly or unknowingly, because they operate in very different environments as well, and they have their own challenges, you know, in the context that they operate from. So even with the right intent, they may end up coming to you with the wrong problem because they themselves haven't understood it well enough. So I think that whole aspect of, you know, driving that clarity in the team, in every team that you interface with, client teams, business teams, your teams, etc., is really the most important point, because once you get that right, everything else just becomes so much more efficient.
Handling customers or how do you work with customers is a different experience altogether that you have.
Absolutely.
Because I had, I think, 2-3 very interesting ones, where once we sat for a workshop where we had to understand the existing process, their problem statement and so on and so forth. It was, I think, for 2.5 weeks, but when we started, I insisted that we do interviews with some of the ground level users as compared to the super users who were at the mid management level.
Right.
So we split into 2 teams, and once we reconciled the notes, we realized there was a very big delta in what was told to us by one group and what was told from the other group. So we replayed that back, and that's when even they as an organization realized that they believe the process to be A, but what's happening on the floor is B. Okay, and we're trying to build a tool which is A dash, slightly more advanced version of the process, and there will be a huge gap to fill. A 2-week process now became a 12-week one for us, where we then took up a consultancy activity with the customer to help bridge between A dash, A and B. Where do you want to be? So who you're talking to within the client organization also makes a very, very big difference. And as you rightly said, customers usually come to us where they are either describing the symptoms or they are saying, this is what I do today. And they probably can foresee a little bit more that this is what I would like to do. And sometimes we come in and we know that, look, the industry has moved so much ahead. Okay, it's like the unstated need. You don't even still know that this can be offered to you, which will completely wow what we are doing. And even as consumers of technology, none of us would have imagined a camera and a phone merged together at probably a couple of decades ago. Okay, where now it's just a very given assumption. So maybe they are at that threshold. So you as a product owner, and here's my word, the product owner, kind of need to be that SME, that guide the consultant who helps them navigate through all of these things. And then there is a very interesting person in every client organization whom I feel we are responsible as product owners to empower, is the business owner from that side. Because he or she is driving a change in her organization. And no one likes change. She's going to get trolled. They're going to get beaten up when things go wrong. Maybe a little bit of a pat saying, oh, great job done. So you really need to empower that person in that organization to make sure they succeed and they become your product champions in turn. But while you have the account and the sales team working with them to support,
Right.
I think as product owner, that connect with the product champion always helps, because finer nuances
Absolutely.
is what we can always percolate towards them.
Absolutely. And just taking a popular analogy in this case, maybe an example like if Henry Ford would have asked the consumers, like, what do you want? They would have just asked for a better bullock cart, right? Nobody would have been able to articulate that, you know what, I actually want a car. Because as a product manager, and this is obviously a more philosophical example, but the key point here is, as a product manager, you know two things. You know the user and you know the product.
And you know what the industry is well.
Agreed. And you know what the industry and the ecosystem is, right? Because of that, you get to be in a very interesting position where you are able to you're able to dive deeper into the customer's expectations, and you can see beyond what the customer is seeing in terms of understanding what they really need, because you have the product lens, you have the ecosystem lens, and you also have the consumer lens, right? And that's where you can help the customer. In this case, maybe a champion or even an internal customer, because, you know, business teams that are customers for you. You could help them understand the problem better, and you could help them see it more clearly from the product lens, from a scalability lens, from a more fundamental lens, to be able to get to the clear definition of the problem, right? Because more often than not, sometimes when you seek more information can also sometimes be very confusing, right? And obviously, again, you got to strike the right balance, as we spoke about earlier as well, because sometimes when you have too much information, it's very difficult for you to call out what you should focus on and what you should not. Okay, and that's where this whole acumen of, you know, blending these different worlds, like the product world, the user world, the business world, the ecosystem world, will allow you to get to that magical spot where you can pinpoint the problem more accurately than any of these other stakeholders, because of the place that you operate from in terms of the intersection of these
that
worlds.
amalgamation or the intersection where business, technology, problem, everything comes together, is your play field.
Yeah, and that sandbox is something that you got to earn the right to play in, right? Because it requires a certain level of maturity, it requires a certain level of awareness, it requires a certain level of sensitivity to different stakeholders as well. So I think that's a good coming together of different ideas in terms of, you know, how we could look at this whole.
That's where I think a very big change in the awareness levels that I talked about earlier has taken place. We've gone past that phase where we are looking at project timelines, project management. You know, this is where I think that evolution took place.
Yeah, and I think this is where this whole product storytelling, you know, becomes so much more important, because if you make all your people good at this, if you make yourself better at it, and if you even make the business teams better at it, and eventually even the client better at it, right, where they become great at defining the problem all the time, you know, that whole rigor on defining the problem and falling in love with the problem rather than falling in love with the solution.
Absolutely.
And
I think that is very, very important.
Yeah, because the more you focus on the problem, the better your ability to build the story will be, right? And once you have the right story, as you rightly mentioned, once you have the right product story, the right feature story, the right user story, you are in a much better position to bring things together.
It's a very interesting point you made. Whom do you fall in love with? The product or the problem?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Most of the time, because we are spending so much time with the product,
Yeah.
we are absolutely in love with the product.
Yeah.
So before even I have heard a few things from the customer,
Yeah.
in my head I'm already matchmaking.
Yeah.
Problem A, solution A. Problem
Yes.
A, feature B.
Yes.
All right, this customer is going to absolutely love us.
Yes.
But the thing at that point is I have to very consciously hold back.
Yes.
Let me hear what the client is
Correct.
actually facing.
Absolutely.
What is his day pain? What is he doing?
Right.
And then do the matchmaking.
Correct. And sometimes the most difficult client can actually bring up the most insightful problem. And I think we sometimes get too biased with things like you just mentioned, right? How do you switch off the product mindset and just keep the customer mindset open for a certain duration of time so that you can objectively take in all the inputs? Then you switch on the product mindset and then evaluate that input in the context of the product. But if you keep the product mindset on while consuming the input, your consumption will be completely conditioned by the product mindset, which might allow you to, which might make you miss out on some important inputs or insights that are coming through as a part of that requirements gathering conversation, right? So how do you switch off certain mindsets and switch them on demand is really going to decide how effective you are, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I think that's where you compartmentalize a little bit.
Yeah.
So again, when we go back and when we are doing these user interactions and when we play that mind, the focus again is very simple. What is the user story?
Yeah.
What is the user problem that you are looking to solve? I always tell my product managers that you have to be great storytellers.
Yeah.
And to tell the great story, you have to give me the plot first.
Correct.
Okay. So when you're going for these meetings, get the plot and come back.
Correct.
And then we'll build a story around it. Okay. So if you're focused on that, I think once your user story is right, then you can work on where the problem matchmake is. I'm very happy with you matchmaking at that point. Where I get very concerned is where they come back and say, this can't be done in our product. Okay, I get very, very defensive about it.
Yeah.
That you have already marked out saying, we can't do this, or this will need a customization. And that is the point I want to guard them. Do not matchmake when you are listening to the problem.
Absolutely.
Listen to the problem, absorb what they want to do, and then come back to the drawing board and then figure out which elements come into.
Absolutely. So just to add one more point in that earlier point you made around assumptions, right? The other thing that you could look at is suspended judgment, right? You don't have to be too judgmental about the input you're receiving. You suspend your judgment. You switch off the product mindset for that duration of time until you're consuming the input. Once you have the input, then you switch on the product hat and you will be in a better position to process that input. Because more often than not, you hear this, right? Where you say, oh, immediately you'll have a response. The moment you talk about a requirement, oh, this can't be done, right? Now, that is a tendency that comes from falling in love with the product rather than falling in love with the problem, right? Because you know the product so well and you're obsessing over the product, which is a great thing. But you also have to obsess over the problem. You also have to obsess over the customer. And you got to obsess over these things in a manner which is harmonious, because that's when you do justice to everything, right?
And healthy.
Yeah, because there is no product without the consumer and there is no consumer without the product, right? So they don't exist in watertight compartments. They are constantly building each other. The consumer is building the product is building the consumer. And you're the one who is actually making this story happen, right? So how do you ensure that that harmonious evolution of the product along with the consumer is playing out of itself and is a process which is operating at its optimal level of effectiveness and efficiency? And that takes a lot of mindset alignment, a lot of teams alignment, a lot of overall strategic alignment as well as execution alignment. And that's what brings it all together.
So you play at that field, that what is happening at that point in time. If you are talking to a business team, say for example, sometimes the account managers come and say, here's what my customer is facing. Do not start solutioning. Let's try and understand what the problem is. Okay. Once you've grasped that completely, then put on the product hat and go rip your product features apart to see, is there something that fits as is, or do we need to make some adjustments to fit? Or if nothing exists, let's look at, do we need to build this? Let's look at it. So you deep dive into different layers. Once you have been convinced that this is a solution, then you deep dive into your operations and your executions piece. At that point, are you talking user story? Maybe a little bit to explain to the team who's working, but the density will vary depending on where you are. So this is when I think, a lot of project managers burn out because they operate the same density across layers, and that's not going to help. And so that balance between how you switch is very, very important.
Very
and there are two things that play a very important role if you want to really sustain as a product manager. One is self-awareness. You need to be highly attuned, very observant, and also have the ability to detach a little bit. Okay. And the second one is flexibility. I don't think there is anyone who's more adjusting and more flexible than a product owner. Because you kind of need to toggle between where are you at the strategy level, at the execution level, at the operations level. Even within the execution and operations level, you will wear these different vertical hats based on who you're talking to, which stage is your product life cycle. I think if you're able to strike these two well, you will sustain for a very long term within it.
And you'll make the right impact.
You'll make the right impact. You'll have the right value created. If you don't, I think then you burn out. I meet some product managers who are my peers, and I see a little bit of frustration set in. Okay, and it is a mix of a few things that are not working in harmony here. So the level of self-awareness that you need to have is very high, and very few product managers actually talk about it.
Correct.
Because maybe it's very intrinsically in our nature.
Yes.
We are very attuned, very observant. What are things that are moving? Before problems occur, we are always on the lookout for it.
Yeah.
Sometimes cynical too.
Yeah.
It is a part of what the job needs us to
Right.
do.
And that's the thing, right? If you don't know what to switch on and what to switch off at different points in time, you got to first also, when you say become a good product manager and manage a product, you yourself are a product of how you manage everything else, right? So if you can know when to switch on what mindset, like you said, when you're in a ruthless execution mode, you don't need to still think about the user story, because that thinking has happened and it has set you on an execution path which now requires a different mindset to deliver, right? So how do you switch on, switch off these hats, or how do you switch on, switch off these mindsets? You know, when do you need to obsess about the product, when do you need to obsess about the problem, when do you need to obsess about the consumer, and when do you need to obsess about the timelines, or when do you need to obsess about execution? They are all going to require different levels of intensity at different points in time. And how do you straddle across these different levels of intensity at different points in time is going to decide how effective you are in creating an impact and how happy you are doing your job. Because if you, like you mentioned, if you mess this up, like you set up the wrong intensities on different mindsets at different points in time, you'll end up stressing yourself out and you'll end up eroding the value that you're creating. You'll end up impacting other folks as well that are working with you. So I think getting to that optimal level of, and which is why it's a craft, like you mentioned, right? It's an art, and it's also a science, where if you can find a way to balance these intensities and bring the right intensity to the right mindset at the right time, will ensure that.
It takes me back to a time when I was in a very high performance team. The stress levels were also very high, but we were trying to accomplish something brilliant. But I was burnt out. There were times I was to come back home, I'm returning, I know I've had a busy day, I've had lots to do, the to-do list is still up, running and shining, but I leave back home with that empty feeling that I haven't created an impact.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is the part of our life, because one thing that we do is firefight. I mean, while there are projects to follow the happy path, many of them don't, and you are firefighting. But that apart, you kind of have that sinking feeling that there has been no impact created, but you're working so hard, it almost feels like you're pushing a bulldozer on a slope. You're working really hard, it's not moving, but all you're doing is making it stand still. Okay, so here's what the things I started doing after that, because I had a conversation with one of my mentors who was not a part of the project, and he gave me a very outside view for it. And what he told me kind of just stayed with me for a very long time. So it's the way you prioritize your tasks. Okay, so put them into high impact, medium impact, low impact. You have to do a mix of them, but the intensity with which you do them would define how you work. These high impact ones probably are like, taking an example, I have to create a PRD for a feature that will be very, very useful for a whole bunch of customers. That needs certain time. You need to very peacefully sit through, work through it, no distractions, with focus you work on it. And then you have your low intensity, medium intensity activities. So with what zest you do, so it depends on that. So for instance, if I have my inner perfectionist, I would want it to shine when I do the PRD. But when I'm sending the meeting notes, maybe I'll do it in a quick way. Doesn't need to be like, hyper perfect. Exactly. But of course it depends with what meeting notes I'm sending. If it's an internal quick discussion, I can send it. But if it's a discussion I've had with the CEO or I've had with the customer, I would want to structure it, make sure the grammar, everything is right. So it will depend. Like the other case I said, the previous team we had a lot of focus on the optics, status reports, expense reports. These are medium to low intensity, but took away so much of our time. So I think that for me works. So there are certain days what I do is I pack my day with medium and low intensity work. I get them out and I start the build up to the day I'm going to do a high intensity work, high impact work, or where I will be very intensely working. and then that day I'm only focused on doing that.
Yeah.
It just gives that sense of balance. Two things it does is avoids that burnout.
Yeah.
Helps me always have a validation on the impact I'm creating, so that that sinking feeling doesn't really exist, and you're not burning out. While yes, you are firefighting, yes, you're doing it, you kind of pick your battles and the intensity that you're going to put in each of the battles based on where they sit on the impact layer.
Absolutely. And
that works for me.
Absolutely. And while all of this is easier said than done, we all understand that, right? When you're in the grind, when you're doing these things, they're a lot more complex than when we talk about it. But that's really the only way to go about it, right? The more clarity you have, the better you can get at getting into, doing these things more efficiently. So I think just one more point in that direction is really about, therefore, also drawing inspiration and energy from people around you, right? Because that's where teams become so much more important, because we humans are a social species, right? And that's something that manifests into our teams as well, because sometimes, despite our best efforts, we're not going to be able to do the prioritization right, not just the product level prioritization, but the prioritization in our minds about what we should be focusing on doing right now, right? And while we know that the larger structure exists, we know that there are certain tasks that are high impact, low intensity, certain tasks which are high intensity, low impact, certain tasks which are high intensity, high impact, that whole intensity impact grid, right? We're not always going to be able to operate at our optimal efficiency on that, right? Sometimes we will get pulled into things because there are variables that we can't control. You get pulled into a meeting, you wanted to spend some focused time on doing a high intensity, high impact task, but something else just hijacks your priority, and something which probably may not be avoidable given the context, right? And then you might have to sort of switch back into a different zone and then switch back into your earlier zone, etc. And as I said, these are easier said than done. So that's where I guess the team around you or the people you work with also play a big role, right? In terms of ensuring that you are able to get that environment that allows you to make these transitions well. You're able to get that environment that allows you to get back to staying focused on what your priority should be at any given point in time, right? So how important is, therefore, the role of the team that you work with? Includes, people you work with, includes people in your team, includes managers that you're working with, etc. How important is that whole ecosystem of people that you're working with?
I think it's very, very critical and important. Unfortunately, as product managers, you are somewhere between individual contributors, people managers. Most of the team you work with, they don't report to you. So now you have to influence them, but you have got zero authority to get something done. So it's a very tricky spot that you are in. And that's where sometimes people ask me that product managers are individual contributors. No, they're actually people managers. Their understanding of stakeholders and their ability to work with people needs to be of the highest order. And the fact that nobody reports to you and you still need to work with them and influence them is what makes it very tricky. But that's where, the way you build that high potential team plays a very, very important role into your life and mindset as a product manager. I have been in teams which have been average, demotivated, and it took a lot of my energy to bring this team on track to deliver. I have been at teams where there's a high energy, high motivated teams, very low on ego. Like, it's the team to be working with. But again, you need to have that energy to match the drive. So I think that is a constant between how you read the energy and you work with them. And brings back to my earlier point, how flexible you are. It will just boil down to that. One of the most underrated skill set that we look at is that flexibility. That today, like you said, you want to do focus work, but you get dragged in every direction that you want. The way I've planned the day and the way the day ends might be completely opposite.
And still, staying motivated and still being in charge and still really ensuring that you're able to realign and get back to how you wanted to. And
especially when you read the team's energy slipping, because I remember this one case where we had that we were trying to deliver a project actually, and we had to implement the product at the client end, and we were faced with hurdles that none of us even imagined would exist. And we were doing our best to go through it, and we were getting beaten by the leadership. So everywhere it looked bleak. Now in all of that, to keep the team on track and get them going is not as simple as what it looks.
Absolutely.
So one of the things in that project that worked for me is I had this conversation with my manager after the reviews happened, because our leadership just refused to even understand what we are working on, or at least we felt that way post every review. And then he told me that, look, the two of you are operating at two different planes. He's looking at it from the impact perspective, that what this means to the team, to the organization, to the revenue, to the customer relationship. And you're looking at it more from the execution layer.
Correct.
How do you navigate through all the challenges that exist?
Correct.
And that's the reason why your visions are absolutely misaligned.
Yeah.
So somebody needs a nudge to move, either you go up at his level and view what from the vantage point that he's doing, or we need to really nudge him to come to a level below and understand the ground realities.
Right.
So that is where I think that nudge was needed. Ultimately, yes, we did deliver, but I think it was the most challenging and draining project for the entire team.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we can just distill it down and summarize a few of the key takeaways, it's really about like you mentioned, right prioritization. It's about right decision making. It's about the right mindset, the whole combination of analytical and creative mindset, right brain, left brain thinking. It's about making the right assumptions. It's about not being judgmental. It's about being able to switch between different levels of intensities on different kinds of mindsets that are required at different points in time in your product management approach on a day-to-day basis. And it's also about somewhere building these teams and transmitting this clarity, this energy, this vision across the team. And most importantly, it's about storytelling. How do you build the right stories internally? How do you build the right product stories, right feature stories, right process stories as well? Because if you want to drive compliance to a process, if you want to drive compliance to a certain technology or a system or a tool that you're using to make things efficient, you would really want people to believe in that process story, because then it becomes incidental to the way they work. So how do you really bring all of this together is really what the crux of product management is all about, right? In terms of not getting overwhelmed, but at the same time not getting underwhelmed as well, and striking the right balance between quality as well as time management, as well as stakeholder management, as well as expectation setting, as well as right storytelling, as well as process compliance, as well as people management. And if you can do a great job of all of this, we can become really good at
it's always said that some of the most entrepreneurs are actually in their previous lives have been product managers, because they are by default achievers. They are on motivated out there to accomplish. So it makes it a very great space to be in.
Right. And today, as they say, SaaS is eating the world, right? Products are everywhere. And that's why product management is a skill that's becoming more important than ever. And I think if we build great product managers, as a part of the whole ecosystem, it's only going to make the world better in terms of seeing great products getting shipped, in terms of seeing great products that we use as consumers as well. It's going to
drive your user experience.
Absolutely. It's going to really make your experience of the world as we know it a whole lot better, right? Which just, on a closing note, maybe we just reflect on this a little bit more as a consumer as well, right? Because we're also consumers of these amazing products that we keep using, right? All the Google products or Apple products or Samsung products or apps that we use like Uber and the food ordering apps, the delivery apps, etc. But sometimes it also because you have that product hat on all the time, whether you want it or not, you're wearing that lens all the time by the virtue of what you do. It's very easy for you to use an app and say, hey, this feature could have been built better, this user experience could have been built better, or this particular feature is not working in the right way. You probably know what mistake the product manager made while architecting this feature. So does it also sometimes take away, or rather make you a little more anxious about things that you use, because you're constantly knowingly or unknowingly picking on things that are hurting the right user experience. So how does that
Both,
work for you?
because when something goes right, you get
able to appreciate
you
it as well.
appreciate that really
Yeah.
well, and you honestly feel the wow. There are so many times I've just downloaded apps only to go through what the user experience is, and you're cynical. So you kind of put that user experience at a very high pedestal, and it can be very frustrating when you suddenly become a consumer and you still have the product lens on. But I think the more we have people like this, we'll have more products that are aligned with user experience, what the user is intending to do. How do you get the user to do things better, faster, in a more comfortable way? I think very simple fundamentals also, if these apps look at, or the products that we use look at, they just work. And like sometimes I feel, we as women, we are 50% of the consumers, and most products are designed for men.
Okay.
So I feel that there is a very big
I don't really
disconnect.
realize that, but yeah, that's a point.
So like the phones we use, for instance, or even basic things like if I'm driving the car, the headrest and whatever I'm wearing on the hair, it is very, very small things, and it can be very frustrating when you realize that many aspects of, product design, experience design exclude 50% of the consumers. So yes, it's a good thing, it's a bad thing. You're appreciating it when things go right really well.
Absolutely.
But when it doesn't, it kind of just frustrates you that why couldn't someone just think through this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I mean, so your ability to appreciate the good things is far more amplified. Yeah, you're more aware and more appreciative of the good things, and you're also, a little more cynical that way in terms of really, pointing out the things that are not working in the right way. And in some sense, it also gives you that little inspiration in your own work where you realize that, I could learn a thing or two from this, and then maybe take it into my body of work, and then, see how I could avoid those mistakes in doing things when I get to it, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's good and bad, but it just helps you. It has a net positive impact in terms of helping you take away something from it that could make you better in what you do, right? And if I had to just, summarize it, I think some of these things are pretty wonderful insights that came through. I guess the whole storytelling part, the whole obsessing over the problem and not obsessing over the solution, the whole aspect of prioritizing the right things, making the right assumptions, and therefore I think building the right mindsets to become great at product management is really the key. So yeah, I think I guess that's what we have time for. We could probably go on and on talking about it, but that was amazing, Meetali. I think that's what we have time for. I guess we've been able to touch upon some very interesting aspects of product management, and I hope people watching this would get some value out of the stuff that we discussed.
Thank you.
Thank you.